The faithful in America's two political parties are putting the final touches on their party nominees. And unsurprisingly, it looks like another rematch of Donald Trump and Joe Biden. As of 11 p.m. Eastern, Trump was a few hundred delegates closer to securing the Republican Party's presidential nomination for the third time in as many elections. 1,215 are needed to clinch. We didn't hear much of anything from his only Republican challenger, Nikki Haley, but Trump did speak after most of the polls closed to celebrate his victories.
It's been an incredible period of time in our country's history. It's been sad in so many ways, but I think it's going to be inspiring because we're going to do something that, frankly, nobody's been able to do for a long time.
Meanwhile, President Biden is already using the primary results to campaign against Trump, saying, quote, "Tonight's results leave the American people with a clear choice. Are we going to keep moving forward, or will we allow Donald Trump to drag us backward into chaos, division, and darkness that defined his term in office?" We have team coverage following Super Tuesday, from the numbers coming in to the analysis of the results and reports from on the ground at candidate headquarters, such as they are. CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto, is following the latest from the data desk. He joins us now. Hello, Anthony. Good to be with you again. You've been staring into those numbers all night long. What's at the top of your mind right now?
Simply this. See this number of delegates Nikki Haley's picked up tonight, which is 10 in our estimate? Well, we came into the night estimating that she would need 97 in order to stave off elimination, if you will, because Donald Trump can clinch, not tonight, but as early as next week in Georgia. So she's not close to that because this map really tells the story. Donald Trump has won a lot of states, and most recently, the latest is in California, right? So we projected that off of our CBS News exit poll. And then the other part of this that I did want to show you is everybody's going to be watching this Senate open primary because this is one in which Congressman Adam Schiff has gone in with a lead, at least in the pre-election polls. And then Steve Garvey, the Republican, is vying for the #2 spot. And what's interesting there is that could set up a Democratic against Republican matchup, which is not assured in California because the top two finishers, which could include, say, Democrat Katie Porter, if she gets into the top two, then it's Democrat against Democrat in November. But this is the sort of the drama that we're going to watch unfold as we go forward tonight.
And drama created by the Schiff campaign, which has been boosting the Republican, hoping to face off against him because Republicans don't do so well in California. Let me ask you, Anthony, about, I guess two questions. In the exit polls, which are only in some of the Super Tuesday states, what's rising up out of those for you? And then I want to ask you if there's anything in the vote and where it's taking place for either Donald Trump or Nikki Haley. When you look at that vote, is it coming in and does it tell you anything interesting or different than what you're seeing in the exit polls?
I've often pointed to this, John, in all the states we've exit polled, including here in North Carolina tonight. You ask Republican primary voters, is Donald Trump fit to be president if he is convicted of a crime? Well, a majority says yes. Why is that important? One is that Nikki Haley's argued that perhaps he's not, and that argument isn't really going anywhere. That explains why. And secondly, what happens going forward if there is a conviction as these trials unfold? We really learn a lot about where Republican voters are right now because they think those charges are politically motivated. And this is them speaking in the exit polls about what they see as the end result of all of that. That underpins a lot of his support and a lot of why it hasn't moved, despite all the controversy that has swirled around him, John.
Anthony Salvanto at the CBS News data desk in New York City. Thank you, Anthony. As we saw, Donald Trump is celebrating his Super Tuesday victories at his Florida estate. And CBS News political correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns joins me now from that very place in Palm Beach, Florida. She's with the Trump campaign. Caitlin, it looks like the room's emptied out a little bit there. So give us a sense of what happened between victories being announced and the empty room behind you.
Yeah, that empty room quickly cleared out. We have been talking all night about this being kind of the setup for the general election, a matchup, a shift away from the primary and towards this rematch with President Biden. But if you look at the speech tonight, if you were looking for kind of a big turn, a big speech to turn to the general election, this was not it. This was a repetition of speeches that I've heard him give over the course of the last several months on the campaign trail, just a shortened version, really kind of ticking through his greatest hits, particularly focusing on immigration. Notably, John, there were no mentions of his rival, Nikki Haley. Not surprising, because his campaign told me earlier today that they weren't even entertaining the possibility that she could win anywhere tonight, so not even focused on her. But it is significant because, as we saw in our exit polling, even though Haley is not doing well in any of these states, she does represent an important constituency that he is going to have to court in the general election, and that is voters that said that they voted for her but would not consider voting for Donald Trump in the general election. So that signals that he still has work to do, but it was interesting to hear him say tonight that party unity and unification will come with success. And so that seems to be a message. Not pivoting, not changing any message, and his campaign told me that we shouldn't expect that at all. We should expect, once he does clinch the nomination officially, which they anticipate will could come as soon as next week, then the mechanics change. He's able to have the infrastructure of the Republican National Committee, for example, and kind of the party apparatus.
It's one of the most consistent things about Donald Trump, this view that he's not going to change anything, the party will change. In an interview with our colleague Bob Costa and Bob Woodward after the 2016 success, they said, don't you have to change to kind of bring people your way in the general election? He said, no, the party's going to come behind me because I'm winning. It's been a consistent part of his approach. How did it play in the room? And the reason I ask this is, of course, it's full of supporters of Donald Trump, but he loves to get the feedback. One of his aides once told me it's like oxygen to him from the people in front of him, and that need for oxygen propels much of his campaign. So on this big night, when basically the primaries are over, were they loving everything he was giving out, or was it just kind of a regular night in Mar-a-Lago?
John, it was interesting because when I was talking to you earlier in the night, the ballroom was filling up. People were really excited to be here. There were hors d'oeuvres being passed around, people having some drinks, talking among friends. It seemed like this was going to be a huge, energetic rally to mark this big turning point in the campaign. That wasn't the case here. Donald Trump didn't have any prepared remarks. He didn't have a teleprompter. He spoke off the cuff, and he didn't really say anything new. And in fact, you know, I was watching behind me. As soon as he started speaking, some people were ready to leave and left. It wasn't this kind of energy that you would imagine would be reflected by a candidate who had an amazing night when you think about it. So that's what I'm going to be watching kind of moving forward is there an effort to kind of focus on that energy? This just seemed like a regular old stump speech and even not as energetic as I've seen on the campaign trail in other states.
Caitlin Huey-Burns in Palm Beach, Florida. Thank you. Former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley faced an uphill battle on Tuesday against her opponent, and CBS News projects that the former UN ambassador lost key states in most of Tuesday's contests. Nidia Cavazos joins us now from Nikki Haley's headquarters in Charleston, South Carolina. So what is the mood now that lots of these results have come in?
John, there is complete silence here from Haley's campaign. There is no word from them yet, no reaction whatsoever to tonight's results. And Haley, throughout the past few days on the campaign trail, had said that her goal for tonight was to remain competitive as she possibly could in this race. She was only focused on Super Tuesday, but it looks like for tonight, she'll only be taking a win in Vermont. And of course, we know that the delegate math is not necessarily favorable to her. It is not on her side. So we'll be waiting, of course, for any sort of public remarks coming in tomorrow. We're not anticipating anything from her end tonight as far as what we've heard from the campaign. Now, the question is not only revolving around what happens next to Nikki Haley. There's this big question. Does she drop out? Does she continue? Does she sort of pause her campaign? But the question is also what happens to Haley's voters. Now, I've been on the trail with Haley covering her campaign for months now. It's been over 200 stops in different states. And what I've noticed is that from, let's say, the voters in Iowa and New Hampshire, they tended to be a lot more conservative, and they were pretty set on voting for a Republican. If it wasn't going to be Haley, they were set that they were going to be voting for Trump. But as we've moved on to other states, even in South Carolina, and for example, we were in Texas yesterday, her voters and her supporters at her campaign stops were so adamant about not voting for Trump. They were ready to move on from him. They don't want to face another, Biden-Trump election. So the question is, where do they go? And we're going to be looking out for some trends during the upcoming months. And of course, we're still waiting on hearing from Haley's campaign and truly knowing what's next. But what's also important to note is that during the past few weeks that I was following her on the trail, I noticed that her message did shift a little bit, and it seemed more of a warning, sort of anticipating tonight's results as they were getting results from their internal data. And Haley was pretty much warning her supporters in the room, saying, we're on a sinking ship right now, and that ship has a hole, and that hole is Donald Trump. And so she would warn them, do you want to continue being on this ship, or do you want to change and go in another direction? So to her, this was fine. This was sort of her closing message and her final pitch to voters. If they wanted a change, then she was that change and that alternative to Trump.
Nidia Cavazos in Charleston, South Carolina. Thank you. The overwhelming victories of Donald Trump and President Biden on Super Tuesday all but confirm we will see a rematch of the 2020 election come November. While the candidates may be the same, some of the issues and questions facing American voters have evolved in the past 4 years. And I'm joined now by CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett, who is in our New York studio. And here with me in Washington is our senior White House and political correspondent, Ed O'Keefe. Major, unsurprising, but give me your sense of what sticks out to you and what questions are answered that you were thinking about before today.
Well, the big question is, who are the nominees going to be? We know the answer. President Biden and former President Trump. But an underlying question for both, how solid and how firm are their constituencies? Both have issues to deal with. For President Trump, whether Nikki Haley stays in this race or not, can he take those voters who are now, as Nidia just mentioned, more and more identifying themselves as spoiler and stubborn? They're spoilers. They are not inclined to vote for President Trump, even if he becomes the Republican nominee. How does Trump try to address their concerns, their sense of alienation from him and what he represents in the Republican Party? And I'm reminded, John, of what happened in the Arizona governor's race in 2022. Carrie Lake said, McCain Republicans, I don't want you in my coalition. And she lost that race narrowly. A reminder that if you try to tell other Republicans that you're not good enough for me, they won't show up. And you could lose a race that was otherwise winnable. I think that is a message and a lesson that can be learned. Whether or not it will be or not by former President Trump is key. And for the Biden coalition, I'm looking at Minnesota. We talked about this last night on your show. More than 30,000 votes already in the uncommitted category for a campaign that barely got off the ground after Michigan. A signal to the Biden campaign that there are restive progressive Democrats who are deeply dissatisfied about the way the White House is dealing with Israel, Hamas, and Gaza. That's not necessarily something that could lead to Biden's defeat, but it is something that suggests a strain in his coalition that the White House must pay heed to.
Ed, when we think about President Biden, there's reaction tonight, and then I feel like it's basically a two-step or maybe just one continuous thing all the way through the State of the Union in terms of, so how did the Biden president or his campaign react tonight, and then tie that to what you expect or think we might see on Thursday?
Well, you read it at the beginning, and I'd like to go back, if we can, to that statement that they issued tonight from the president, because I think it starts to give us a good sense of where his head is at and where he's headed. When he says that his likely opponent is, quote, driven by grievance and grift, focused on his own revenge and retribution, not the American people, determined to destroy our democracy, rip away fundamental freedoms, and pass another round of billions of dollars in tax cuts for the wealthy. That he himself is now saying this versus his surrogates is a signal that he's had enough of it. and he wants to take him on directly now. He's been quoted in some interviews this week saying, I'm the only guy that's beat him. I know how to do it. I want to get inside his head. I want to do it in the public space. I want to do it rhetorically. I want to do it online. He's doing it here tonight. And what you're going to see going into Thursday is this attempt to, I think, begin tackling one of the big concerns, the economy. We saw today at the White House, he was trying to touch on this with the issue of late fees for credit cards. And these are small ball, kind of 21st century examples of the V-chip, if our most committed know what we're talking about. But it's designed to be like, I hear your concerns. I'm trying to do something about it from this level. The other thing he's got to figure out, how to talk about immigration, because it's a real political issue for him now, not only among independents and Republicans, but members of his own party, because if he swings further to the center and to the right, he's going to upset that base he needs. It's also a basic function of government concern. And remember, he was elected on the premise that he knew how to run the federal government professionally. If he can't do it on immigration, he's in trouble. And to Major's point, he's got to figure out how to get Israel and Hamas to come to a ceasefire, get those hostages released, so that both domestically and internationally, the United States can be seen as helping broker peace.
And those independent voters that he thinks he's going to get, that like Nikki Haley or that Trump can't get back, Gaza and the border are issues they would possibly care about more.
Absolutely. They're salivating over this number tonight, that nearly 8 in 10 of Haley's voters in North Carolina, a big chunk of independents there, would not support the Republican nominee if it's Donald Trump.
Major, in 2016, as I recall, there was a lot of yinging and yanging between, and all the way through the Trump presidency, sort of Donald Trump would be Donald Trump, and then advisors would trickle out and say, well, he's going to pivot now, he's going to be more disciplined and that kind of thing, and that never stuck for very long. Are we still going to go through that yin and yang, or is what the president said tonight actually quite instructive, which is to say he doesn't think he can win back the Haley voters by kind of kissing up to them, for lack of a better term. Instead, he's just going to talk about the border and basically say to them, you should be frightened and therefore come vote for me.
Well, he's going to talk about immigration and inflation, and in the same context. And in 2016, as he was pursuing the Republican nominee and the nomination, then becoming the nominee, Donald Trump was a nostalgia-based candidate. He wanted to remind people of a better time in America that he could return them to. He will now be a double nostalgia president. What do I mean by that same Make America Great thing, that sense that there's a lost America that can be rediscovered, but also doubly nostalgic for, well, when I was president, you felt better about your economic present and your economic future. That double nostalgia message, I think, is going to be repeated over and over and over again in various forms. And if there is going to be any overarching discipline to former President Trump's approach, that'll be it.
That'll be it. Ed, let me ask you about COVID-19. When we talk about the economy, there's this weird thing where people kind of forget that there was this massive pandemic which cratered the economy all over the world, and that part of the situation we're in now is still recovering from that COVID-19 economy. Is the Biden campaign, is the president going to go back and do that history again? In other words, say, people have nostalgic feelings about Donald Trump, but remember his handling of COVID, and I took on this issue when I came into office, and I righted the ship, or is that dangerous for some reason?
It's dangerous in the sense that they don't necessarily want to look back quite like that. Ask Ron DeSantis how campaigning on COVID-19 went, right? But what they are going to be able to do is say all the things we enacted in the wake of it, the infrastructure plan, the investing in science and technology, the economic stimulus that was put in place that maybe torched inflation a bit, but ultimately helped the economy continue growing, that is now being felt because the implementation of it's happening. That's his way of saying, we took you out of that economic downturn. We're roaring now. And while you may not feel it or may not be thinking it or may not be telling pollsters that the economy is in great shape, really it is, wages are turning around. And the one thing they are hopeful about, and part of why they will continue talking about it that way, is if you look at our polling for the last 4 months, perceptions of the economy have been turning positive. Majority still don't see it that way, but the number keeps shrinking in the negativity column and improving. And the Biden campaign sees that too and says, if that can start happening, it may happen a little later than we'd like come the summer, then maybe we finally connected with people on the idea that we helped rebuild the economy and things are in better shape.
Final question to you, Major. Does it feel like negative partisanship, the idea that you rally your voters around the bad qualities of the other person, it almost feels like both candidates have to develop an Trump has to come up with an anti-Biden coalition, and Biden has to come up with an anti-Trump coalition, and that's the way we should be thinking about the race?
I would say for the president, he has to have something that answers two V questions. Are you vigorous, and do you have a vision? The age issue is not going to go away. There's no way he can address it other than by proving he is vigorous enough for the job, because every presidential vote, John, as you well know, is a projection, not just for the next year, but the next 4 years. And that vision and vigor part is something that President Biden and his team are going to have to find a way to fill in. For President Trump, he has one structural advantage, not only inflation and immigration generally, but the perception among voters, especially independents, that whatever the statistics are, they believe President Biden undervalued those issues way too long, did not address their concerns when they were having them. And that's something that structurally works for President Trump now. And as to Ed's point, will it work all the way to November? There are hopes in the Biden campaign that those perceptions and either rhetoric or policies from the White House will begin to turn that.
Major Garrett and Ed O'Keefe, thank you both very much.